These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Sargon II, king of Assyria, is a man of paradoxes. Probably the single most well-attested person in all of ancient Mesopotamian history, so much about his origins are unknown that we aren't even properly sure how his name was pronounced or what it meant. He is rightly famous as one of, if not the most successful king in all of the Assyrian Empire, yet he came to the throne under an ill-omened cloud, and even now, in the summer of 720, after a year and a half on the throne, he's not only failed to secure the sort of inaugural victory that would legitimize him and show that he holds divine favor, but his very first great battle was a humiliating defeat, beaten by exotic foreigners without even facing the enemy he'd gone to attack. But just as Sargon is now desperate for divine favor, I, too, am desperate for your favor. Show your approval of this show with a like and a subscribe and a comment down below, but if you really want to bestow the sort of riches to build an empire, consider becoming a Patreon patron or a YouTube channel member, or just donating directly at oldeststories.net. Acting in this manner can allow you to become a blessed instrument in the hands of your favorite god. Unlike me, however, Sargon is far more proactive in rescuing his personal situation. Many of the most notable campaigns in history begin because the man leading the army knows that if he returns home and demobilizes, he'll probably lose everything. And so, possibly the first such campaign in history begins as Sargon declines to return to the Assyrian heartland. He is, you will recall, just reeling from a pretty nasty defeat just outside the city of Dur, which is basically the eastern edge of Mesopotamian civilization. First off, simply to keep an army intact after a major loss in the field is a mark of significant professionalism. An army of farmers would be hard to keep together without momentum behind you, and they would be thinking right now about the needs of their fields as the autumn approached. Even many professional armies would be questioning their commander in such a situation, or would have melted away completely following the defeat. More and more we're getting the sense not just that the Assyrian machine of an army and empire is exceptional in world history, but Sargon, the man who has arisen through tremendous opposition, also appears to be a remarkable man. It takes a certain rare charisma to take over such an institution, and then yet another skill set to manage it as skillfully as he does. Now he takes this defeated army and marches them from the eastern edge of Mesopotamia all the way around the Fertile Crescent, crossing the Tigris River, traveling up the Euphrates, then back down the Levant, all the way to the region around modern-day Israel, to Samaria and Hamath. Now, if he had planned a Western campaign in advance, like the year before, he would have sent letters to various governors to arrange and prepare stockpiles and logistics for him, but until at least late summer, he had been planning on campaigning in Babylonia. To be able to move a large professional army across the empire, completely unplanned as far as we can tell, shows a mastery of the systems that he has seized control over. And he managed not just to move the army, but he managed to move a full set of siege logistics as well. Now the enemy here is Yahu-Bihdi of Hamath. Now you'll see his name sometimes as Yahu-Bihdi or Ilu-Bihdi, but even though he was in Aramean Hamath, he was a Yahwist, or at least from a Yahwist family. It's one of the very small occasional reminders that we get in history that Israel and Judah may have been the only officially Yahwist nations, but the worship of the great God of the Bible existed beyond their borders. Remember that the Israelites were, in origin, a tribal set of peoples, or at least semi-nomadic, so it shouldn't surprise us that a portion of their population remained that way and didn't worry quite so much about borders and things and show up elsewhere in the Levant. If I had a time machine, straight up, My top destinations would be, well, first to interrogate the Magi who came to baby Jesus, and to interview Balaam, son of Beor, but a third top spot might be to bring a modern rabbi to interview Mr. Yahu-Bihdi to see what he happened to think about our shared God. Anyway, Sargon is quite convinced that Yahu-Bihdi is a terrible person. He broke his oaths to the Assyrian Empire and persuaded neighbors to also abandon Assyria. And then, if you can believe it, he put his trust in his own soldiers rather than the good and benevolent soldiers of Assyria. The only solution to that, of course, is to have the Assyrian army dye the Orontes River and the deserts around Hamath red through the power of benevolence. Or spears. Probably also the power of many spears. And by benevolence, I really mean battering rams, and once the army made their friendly entry into the city, they kindly flayed Yahu-Bihdi publicly in the middle of town, then gently and peacefully flayed his family and the elites, and then in a mostly peaceful protest, set a little bit of fire to the entire town. You can always count on the benevolence of the god Asher and his mortal soldiers to take care of rebellions. Note that Sargon brought his battering rams to solve the problem of sieges that Tiglath-Pileser and his son kept running into. Why did Tiglath-Pileser not bring battering rams? Why was he unable to break through the fortresses that Sargon is just going to plow straight through? It's actually a pretty significant mystery. By all accounts, there's basically nothing in Sargon's toolbox that Tiglath-Pileser didn't have access to. It really seems to come down to the old proverb, it's not the size of your battering ram, it's how you use it. If Sargon has notably reformed any part of the army yet, we don't know about it. We will talk more about the Sargonid theory of battle next episode. It just really seems like Tiglath-Pileser had taken the Assyrian army and made each element of it extremely strong and robust, while Sargon takes all those elements that his successor had pioneered and simply rearranges them into what might be the world's first comprehensive combined arms doctrine. It is possible that he is also personally much more aggressive with his army. In this particular campaign, it could be driven by initial desperation. Remember, he simply can't afford a drawn-out siege of any of these targets, not logistically and definitely not politically. And he's making war on the cities of Karkar, Arpad, Smyrna, Damascus, and Samaria all at once. Almost certainly, he took the risk of marching his battering ram forward when Tiglath-Pileser wouldn't have done so. These are Sargon's first known sieges as king, and one wonders if he had experimented with prototypes of these tactics in whatever his position had been before coming to the throne. But if this is the first time he's brought it all together, it is the hand of genius at work. How is he going to break the walls? With his battering ram. How is he going to get the ram to the wall? With a mix of shielding and covering fire, supported by his chariotry to suppress the defenders on the walls. A battering ram, remember, is a fantastically expensive thing in the context of an ancient army. It might seem to us like it's just a big log, but even just getting a big log was a big deal for Mesopotamians with their lack of good big trees. Then the hassle of moving it from place to place made it rare for even empires to bring more than a small number of rams anywhere. Then bringing it to the walls and hanging out right under the enemy's fire for an extended period of time as you cracked said walls usually meant heavy casualties. So perhaps Tiglath-Pileser simply knew that ramming would be too expensive given his tactical mix, and it was only the combined arms approach of Sargon that enabled these explosive takedowns of multiple city walls in the period of just a handful of weeks. Because remember, Sargon's going to win this battle of Karkar, he's going to sack Samaria and Hamath, possibly also attack Arpad and Damascus, and then turn them all into organized provinces, arranging a mass deportation so severe that it would have religious impacts still felt today in the 10 lost tribes of Israel, and decimate the region of Samaria so thoroughly that it would be considered a wasteland even by the fairly backward standards of other Levantine nations. And he has to do all this before the new year starts, having already wasted the front half of the year in his failed Babylonian campaign. The only way forward for him, or at least the way he seems to have gone with, is hyper-aggressive terror tactics enforced by a well-oiled military system. Move fast, hit hard, flay your enemies. We've seen all of these pieces before, but Sargon puts them all together, and at the end of the year, he's able to return home to Kalhu, and then on to the sacred city of Ashur to celebrate his victory, plunder and glory in hand. I don't want to say that he had no political problems after this. It could well be that he continually had political problems, which may have been part of what motivated his continued high level of religiosity, but certainly we don't hear about them being suggested anymore. One thing we notice is that partway through his reign, he starts fudging the records of his initial rise to power, focusing on the greatest successes of this 720 campaign without being super specific about when it all happened, to sort of give the impression that he conquered Samaria and opened up trade with Egypt all by himself and right as soon as he took control. The question of his conquest of Samaria has confused a lot of scholars over the years, but it seems pretty clear by now that the initial fall of Samaria did take place at the very end of Shalmaneser's reign, but importantly, he died before it could be claimed as a victory internally and before it could really be properly integrated. So Sargon's claim of victory in 720 would have seemed to the northern Israelites as a second war and a second defeat, but from an Assyrian standpoint, it's not wrong to see it as one incomplete victory followed up by a proper win to finish things off. Note that he claimed also in this year to have opened up the markets with Egypt, and this is an interesting claim as well and takes a bit of stepping back. You see, back during the reign of Shalmaneser, Samaria didn't just rebel because they thought they could stand up to the might of Assyria with the power of God on their side. No, the book of 2 Kings tells us that Hoshea was sending messengers to Sargon IV, who at the moment is ruler of Lower Egypt, though possibly not very much of it, as his dynasty is sort of crumbling amongst rival powers in the Nile Delta. Still, even though we can see that Egypt is nearing a nadir while Assyria is surging towards its glory, the Samaritan king seeking to preserve his independence has not a whole lot of viable political options. It turned out in the end that this was also not a viable political option, and we looked last episode at how Samaria was crushed as basically the last thing Shalmaneser did in his life. So when Sargon got to the region then, he found Samaria as an Egyptian sympathizer and Gaza as an Egyptian ally alongside Yahu-Bihdi's coalition. And because this alliance came with a very modest Egyptian dispatch of expeditionary troops, Sargon was able to lay claim to have defeated Egypt in battle amidst this wider conflict. The next thing we hear after Sargon has re-established control over the whole region is that the trading post near Gaza had been built when Tiglath-Pileser had conquered the region, has now been reopened, having been shut down during the Gaza revolt. Now, the significance of this depends on how you reconstruct a key damaged line. It could be just that some minor trade occurred in this trade post, possibly with the people of the Sinai region who weren't all that strongly tied to the crumbling Egyptian state. Or it could be that he secured some sort of trade deal with one of the Egyptian powers currently competing for the throne as the third intermediate period of Egyptian history wears on. We don't have details about what that would have looked like, but it would not have been surprising if Sargon was communicating with some or other of the Egyptian powers fighting over their country. Something we'll note more later is that Egyptian items are currently quite in fashion in the Assyrian heartland, sort of like Westerners being fascinated by Eastern anime and culture, and they were going nuts over Egyptian statuary and ornamentation, which I'm told was every bit as compelling for them back then as K-pop and anime are today. Anyway, Sargon seems to have thought it was significant, whatever he did, and it is interesting to note that he was probably poking a finger in Egyptian politics, even if we don't have more details on that. Before moving on from his accession, however, it is interesting to note that there were only two things that he fudged to move right to the start of his reign. The opening of Egyptian trade, which is not normally something we hear Assyrian kings boasting about, and specifically the conquest and decimation of Samaria. Sargon had fought a number of Levantine states in his lightning campaign of 720, but only Samaria was totally decimated, and only Samaria was given a place of pride as happening basically at the start of his reign. Now, someone with the right mindset might tie this to biblical history, wherein somehow Sargon knew that the conquest of Samaria would be vastly more important in the longest time scales than pretty much any other single thing he accomplished in his life. You might even tie all of his actions and their consequences with the will of Yahweh if you really wanted to. But perhaps more interesting is if we decide that Sargon was not operating under the influence of the Holy Spirit of the biblical God, then we don't really have a good understanding of why he singled out Samaria for such special treatment. It hadn't been the leader of the wider rebellion, nor was it the most significant of powers in the region. It wasn't the only one seeking an Egyptian alliance, and it wasn't the only one that rebelled. The question of why he came down so hard on Samaria has been uniquely studied in modern times without, I think, a satisfactory answer. Something about this particular episode, probably only a few short weeks in a wider frantic campaign, stuck out to Sargon, but sadly I don't know that we can say for certain what it was. 719, then, opens as the third year of his reign. This often gets recorded as the third Palu, and Palu used to mean a campaign season or a year in which the army went out, but because it's now ritually assumed that the army is going out every year, even in years when it doesn't actually go out, Palu counts are now just year counts. It's also his eponym year, when he finally has enough legitimacy to claim the year name for himself. Now, Sargon has no shortage of problems as he surveys his borders. Babylon, Elam, Urartu, and Phrygia are all encroaching, and domestically he likely still has issues that need to be handled delicately. But it seems that the most urgent need of the year is the land of Manea. Now, for nearly this entire show, it has been the general default assumption that civilization is basically impossible in the Iranian mountains. Elam has always been an exception, but it too isn't fully in the Zagros Mountains. The semi-settled Manaean kingdom is thus an interesting development. Their lands stretch sort of in a finger, running north-south, and thus forming the eastern edge of both Urartu and Assyria now. These decades around 700 are particularly important, something of a peak of Manaean civilization, yet are deeply unclear to us because archaeology in the region is underdeveloped. I do actually expect some interesting things to be coming on this front in the next few decades if the Iranian regime doesn't collapse and continues to fund expeditions in the way it has been. But for what we do know is that in 719, the Manaean kingdom, which appears to have been stable for decades by now and consistently loyal of Assyria for about 25 years, well, it kind of fragments. The northern lords of Manea no longer feel like they're being adequately protected by their Assyrian allies and overlords, particularly not from Urartian encroachment. And so they decide to split off and become a separate kingdom loyal to Urartu, while southern Manea, led by longtime loyalist King Iranzu, stayed close to Assyria. Mitati of Zakirtu ends up in charge of the coalition of northern cities aligned with Urartu, and Sargon makes sure to point us out that Mitati and his co-conspirators are deeply evil people who commit vile crimes. More important than what was going on in Manea itself, however, was how all this setup was just building up for the coming showdown with Urartu. You see, Sargon shows an awareness of Urartu as a foe in his discussions of these years, but because his primary annals are propaganda and our main supplementary texts are just logistical and accounting letters, we never hear him say directly that Urartu is the most significant threat and daunting challenge to total Assyrian supremacy. And yet most people who study this period see Sargon as particularly focused on the northern threat from at least this year onward. From our normal vantage point, it can feel like we're watching some kind of grand strategy game, all clean maps and hard borders viewed from space, but the letters on the ground show that the border was highly contested. From the northern town of Tamnuna, an administrator has been having chronic issues with Urartian raids. Sargon had, in a previous letter, told him to resolve the raids with a fairly cunning ruse. They were to push their work crews into the region of Sarduriani, across the border, but in fact probably more on the Assyrian side of the mountains, and thus not under strong Urartian control. For a set of days they were to work glazing bricks, possibly as if to build a fortress foundation. Then, on a specific day, the plan said they were all to leave. When they leave, they're to have some Ukayan tribesmen from the mountains guard their bricks on their behalf, then go to the town of Elizkun to make a show of making more bricks for 10 days. The plan says that if the Urartians arrive to smash up the brick stockpile in Sarduriani, then King Rusa, thinking that he's preventing the construction of an enemy fortress in his territory, would be sort of exposing himself, exposing his army. And so the main army can come and rush back to Sarduriani, with the Ukayans having held off the Urartian raiders, and then the main Assyrian army can catch them unawares and crush them. I say the main Assyrian army. This obviously isn't the annual campaigning army. Every province at this point has a sort of guard army, which is what is being passed around here, just to clarify that. Now, all this is a fine plan. You make a show of putting something important in one place, make a show of moving your army away, and then, boom, you can ambush the enemy when they think that your army is not watching your pile of bricks. So it's a good plan, and one assumes that if the Urartians didn't take the bait, then Assyria really would put a fortress on the wrong side of the border. But the leader of the region, Nabu-Usala, reported back to the king that he had sent spies out. We'll be seeing more about spies. We have a sense that most nations employed spies, but we hear far more about them under Sargon than from any previous era. But these spies note that 3 governors of Urartu arrived to take the bait. The letter is then badly damaged, but it appears to report that the plan went generally well, at least until making contact with the enemy. It seems that while Nabu-Usala was able to well control his portion of the situation, the Ukayans, on whom he was relying to hold Sarduriani, fled far faster than expected, and even their assistance as builders came to an end, with the builders also fleeing from Elizkun. The last we hear in this letter, Nabu-Usala is demanding that the Ukayans send 500 spearmen to reinforce the situation, but notably doesn't request anything of Sargon himself. Nabu-Usala is just appraising Sargon of what sounds like a fairly tense situation. Now, this is a great little letter because it has tactical depth in an era so often starved for tactical exposition. But also, this is just a confrontation across the border. This isn't, as far as we know, part of any major push. A few hundred men on either side, maybe low thousands of men moving around in total, is a decently hefty military force by the standards of the ancient world. We're spoiled in our discussions of ancient empires that, ever since the late Bronze Age, have loved to have armies numbering in the tens of thousands, but as long as the full strength of an empire wasn't pressing against them directly, a few hundred men, or sometimes even just tens of men, are enough to take plunder, move borders, and shift the realities on the ground. And while plenty of these probably were just hit-and-run raids, this shows that not only could there be fairly intricate tactics involved, but also that Sargon himself was sending strategies to various leaders around the frontier. Sargon himself is clearly tactically brilliant. We can see it in letters just like this. But these small-scale forces, led by governors and local leaders, are also clearly capable of complex planning independent of the main Assyrian army. Can other nations deploy similar border raiding and response forces? Probably, but the Assyrian abilities to deploy both better soldiers with more logistical weight, plus possibly a higher average quality of commander, creates a degree of genuine pressure on every other nation that they share a border or region with. And we need to think more about that. In modern times, even hostile borders are usually fairly quiet. The main threat is a renewed war, not day-to-day violence. The border between the Koreas, for example, doesn't have raiding. It's got a lot of posturing and fear and the very occasional artillery salvo. Modern war, with its rapid and devastating escalation potential, doesn't have nearly as much room for border skirmishing unless one or both sides are low state capacity, like most African wars or the Palestinian conflict. But for a nation bordering Assyria, the neighboring governor had the ability and incentive to regularly plunder or devastate to a certain degree, secure in the knowledge that if you struck back too strongly, the Assyrian army wasn't, if it wasn't busy somewhere else, you could be staring down the barrel of one of those 10,000-man campaigns sufficient to utterly crush all but the most tenacious of foes. We don't see it explicitly so often, but keep it in mind as a background pressure here, both an offensive aura imposed by Assyria on her foes, but also as a constant threat on most borders. Anyway, the point is that in 719, Manasseh split into the northern and southern kingdoms. Sargon arrived in support of the south and began shattering northern walls with his battering rams, leveling rebel cities wherever he could, and carrying off the people and goods as plunder. Then he burned whatever was left. The people he captured were deported to the Neo-Hittite provinces in the northwest, and we're not told that he moved anyone back into the region afterwards, leaving perhaps a desolation similar to that of Samaria. But for unclear reasons, his victory is not complete. Matati of Zakurtu not only survives, but is confirmed back on his throne. Matati gives a nominal submission, but it appears he's right back licking the boots of his Arartian masters basically straight away. It is possible, though the timeline isn't super clear, that Sargon ended the campaign early because his ally, Aranzu, the rightful king of Manasseh, died around this time. It could be that Sargon ended the campaign just when he ran out of time and logistics, finding the mountains too difficult, but I rather suspect that when he heard that Aranzu had died, he needed to conclude his campaign because his justification for war had changed, and because he needed to handle the succession of southern Manasseh. To me, at least, that makes more sense for why the demonized enemy Matati would be allowed to survive a campaign like this. We don't know why Iranzu died, though he was probably rather old because we have records for him for quite a while. One would hope that with a war active he died in battle, but who really knows? The real issue is that he had 2 sons, and stop me if you've heard this story before, but both of these sons thought that they should be the king. Asa was installed on the throne by Sargon personally, presumably at the conclusion of the 719 campaign, but his brother, Ulusunu, also wanted to get in on that kingly action. And so Ulusunu built up a coalition of Manaean nobles who opposed Urartian influence and got himself an alliance with support and resources from King Rusa of Urartu. Once Sargon was gone, Manaea descended back into civil war, and Asa would die in battle against the Urartian coalition 3 years later. Thus, essentially the whole of the northeast would slowly turn against Sargon while he was busy elsewhere, this campaign being yet another failure in strategic terms, even if he was at least victorious in all his pitched battles. The next year, his 4th, was also putting out a fire. On the opposite corner of the empire, up in Anatolia, lay yet another minor kingdom that was falling under the influence of yet another rising power. Mita of Mushki, remembered in the west as the wealthy King Midas of the Phrygians, was at the top of his game. His influence stretched through central Anatolia and was increasingly felt in the regions around there. For him, the kingdom of Tabal was the gateway into Syria with all its wealth and trade, but Tabal was an Assyrian vassal ever since some campaign of Shalmaneser V a few years prior. So Midas, with his diplomacy and possibly also his golden wealth, decided instead of attacking Assyrian territory to conquer the passes he needed, he simply tempted the kings in the area to rebel and join him. Kiaki of Tabal may have taken him up on his offer pretty much as soon as Sargon had taken the throne, joining in with the rebellions of Babylon and the Levant. Sargon only reports that he hadn't been paying tribute for some time, so it didn't just happen here in the 4th year. Still, a victory would show the Phrygians and the Urartians that Assyria did not intend to tolerate interference. Now, Tabal is interesting because it doesn't seem it was ever actually a single nation. Rather, the region between the Kilikkian Pass at southern Anatolia and the Halys River that demarcates central Anatolia was in this period broadly called Tabal, and it appears that the statelets of this place maintained a general alliance during the Neo-Hittite Iron Age. Of course, when the Assyrians arrived, they needed to systematize and formalize all of this, so they declared the king of Shinutu the general lord over the region. And this king, a fellow named Kiaki, used his power to immediately defect over from the Assyrian Empire and join the far more regionally important Phrygian sphere of influence. And it also bordered the western fringe of Urartu, so it became an important buffer state between the 3 powers, and appears to have profited greatly from trade enabled by the rising wealth of Anatolia being transported to Syria and Urartu, even though they are only independent for a few years at this point. The only description we have here is that the royal city of Sinutu was overwhelmed like a fog, which could well mean that an army larger than the population of the entire city surrounded the town. Remember the logistics of warfare here. Even a town putting up a determined and total resistance is unlikely to be able to arm more than a third of their adult population, with women being ineffective in combat and a good chunk of the men being old or unfit for whatever reason. Even 5% of a population under arms is a significant strain, but if we assume that Shinutu is in desperate defense mode, which Sargon indicates they were, then they could not bring as many men to the fight as the Assyrian army, even in this case. We don't have specific numbers, but it would be very unusual if Shinutu was more than 20,000 people in total, and possibly less than 10,000. Meanwhile, the range for the size of the army in this year, with no other campaigns or simultaneous actions occurring at the same time, is likely between 15 and 25,000 men. Overwhelmed like a fog indeed, the army literally has more people in it than the entire city that they're conquering. And that's before taking into account the material, training, and tactical disparity here. Now, we have no idea why Shunnutu resisted quite so fiercely. They must surely have known the scope of what was coming towards them, but Sargon tells us and acts like they resisted to something close to the last able man. For their trouble, well over half the survivors and possibly close to every living survivor was deported to the Assyrian heartland, and a rather surprising amount of wealth was plundered. Evidence that the midpoint of trade between three rising empires was a fairly lucrative place to be if you could keep your head. The rest of Tabal was left unmolested, though presumably pressured back into submission, while Kurti of Atuna was made leader of the region, and granted the land around the depopulated Shunnutu as a territorial concession to enhance his personal power relative to the other lords of Tabal. Now, it's hard not to think that at least some of this was a message to King Midas of Phrygia, whose meddling continued unabated. In the very next year, 717, the most important Neo-Hittite city, Carchemish, rebelled against Assyria, throwing off its vassal status and declaring itself aligned with Phrygia. While Sargon believes that the king of Carchemish, Pisiris, did this out of an abundance of evil within his heart, geopolitically you could call it an interesting move. Carchemish is not on the fringes of the empire exactly, certainly not anymore. While it's not in a core region, there's still a lot of frontier on every side around it, and so the city is likely relatively protected from external foes. And so on one hand, Pisiris here is balancing the amount of wealth he expects to generate within the empire versus how much wealth he expects from being aligned with Anatolia. On the other hand, it's balancing the security situation with the expectation that its walls will be able to withstand an Assyrian siege. Pisiris has probably learned from Shalmaneser V's terrible siege attempt that the empire probably can't afford a protracted campaign just to secure one city, even if it is a city as important and prestigious as Carchemish. Now, to all of this, especially the economic motives, we can only say that it's quite interesting. We don't know the exact breakdown of the relative economies, but being within the empire would have had a certain weight of taxation that being independent would free King Pisiris of. But for the balance of trade otherwise to be so in favor of Anatolian and probably also Urartian trade rather than Assyrian intra-empire trade is kind of telling. We hear in some letters that Carchemish in particular was having issues with its people regularly escaping out to the region of Arpad, where presumably the Assyrian yoke was a bit lighter, and also that the nearby town of Tel-Barsip, just a little bit south on the Euphrates, was at least seen as being regularly favored in various regional allocations. And this makes sense. Tel-Barsip is, at this point, a properly Assyrian city, not just a vassal, and it's an important logistical hub for army and administration, and so Carchemish probably feels not jealous, like in an emotional sense, but like economically threatened by the fact that more and more people are increasingly choosing to cross the Euphrates at Tel-Barsip rather than crossing and getting on a boat for the Euphrates at Carchemish, which of course was a major source of its wealth and importance. So it's being sort of undercut by another city just a little bit further south, and we hear complaints about that. It's interesting. To the military situation, though, we can only note that he turned out to be very, very wrong in thinking that the Assyrian Empire would have difficulty breaching his walls. Now, the course of the campaign is almost completely unrecorded. It's almost as if as soon as Busiris revolted, the full force of the Assyrian army showed up at his doorstep, and then someone simply opened the gates for them, allowing them to walk in, and the city was plundered, with Busiris and his house being particularly ill-treated. Now, there is some modern speculation that Busiris might not have actually been a traitor. After all, he might be the last Neo-Hittite vassal who has not yet been incorporated as a province, and his position was really quite bad in a wider strategic sense, and Sargon might have just wanted the wealth of Carchemish to fund his next big project. Now, I go by default with the written record unless there's a strong reason to doubt it, but do note that Sargon writes very little about this campaign aside from demonizing Busiris and tallying the plunder. We could well explain the ease of this conquest if we assume that Sargon employed spies and traitors to open the gate for him, something we know he liked to do and would have had ample opportunity for in this case. But additionally, the explanation that Sargon is just cracking open a politically unfavorable piggy bank, a wealthy city that needs a bit of integration, and has some friction with the regional capital of Tilbar-Sip, and is stubbornly independent in the middle of integrated territory, well, we can't fully discount that. And if he was doing that, note that the elites of the empire would almost certainly have been aware of it, and it would have been seen, even by those who benefit, as at least somewhat dishonorable. It's a violation of the duty of a patron to protect his loyal clients. That is sort of Roman framing of it. They didn't have exact patron-client relationships, but they did have a similar hierarchical set of mutual obligations in Assyria. But whether or not Sargon was justified, Carchemish was chosen in this year for its money. Sargon had a number of grandiose plans in mind, probably been thinking about them for a while now, and it's time for one of them to start being made into reality. Like all men of great hubris, he envisions reshaping the universe into his own image, founding a society that will ensure prosperity for the people and glory for himself. And in its own way, it'll come to preserve his legacy for the millennia to come, though only because of the ill omens that come to hang about it. Speaking of grandiose projects, though hopefully not ill-omened ones, this podcast can only reshape the universe into a new image through the contributions and support of listeners like you. If you have a bit to spare, think about becoming a patron over on Patreon, or donating directly at oldeststories.net. And if you, like many of us, are struggling under the high taxes of a great empire, you can still help out by liking, subscribing, and sharing the show around. And most importantly, make sure to join us next time as we look at the construction of Sargon's mighty capital, Dur-Sharukin, and ponder what it might have been like to live there. Thank you for listening.
King of the altar smoking neath the trees. They build an idol for every town, from Watchman's Tower down to the sea. Molten calves in Bethel's light, hosts of heaven in the star-cold sky. Burn their sons in the fire to bow, let the children for false gods die. Yet the Lord testified by his prophets and seers, turn you now from your evil ways. He said, keep my covenant, my statutes and law, lest the land beneath you be stripped and bled. They would not hear, they would not fear, stiffened their necks till the sky went black. They followed vain things and then were vain, till the Lord turned his face and he never turned back. Cast from his side and taken away, scattered on the wind with a broken spear. Prophets had cried, turn from your ways, but they hardened their hearts and they would not hear. Strangers came to an empty town, from Babylon cut the Sephar vein. Lions roamed in the broken streets, tearing the flesh of the faithless man. Priests were called from a far-off place, taught to fear the name they'd scorned. Yet every nation served its own God still, half-turned hearts in a land forlorn. They would not hear, they would not fear, stiffened their necks till the sky went black. They followed vain things and became vain.